Welcome to Thriller Recaps. Today, I am explaining the 2024 movie, Roadhouse, explaining every scene as it happens. Watch till the end, and please like, share and subscribe if you enjoy this. Former UFC middleweight fighter Elwood Dalton went to an underground fight. He was set to face Carter Ford, but Carter backed out upon recognizing him. As Elwood left, a furious man, who had lost bets, stabbed him. Frankie, noticing the commotion, approached Elwood. She recognized him as a scammer of fighters but admired his cunning. Seeing the knife lodged in him, she offered to take him to the hospital, but he refused, opting to patch himself up with duct tape instead. Frankie revealed herself as the owner of a rowdy roadhouse in the Florida Keys, struggling to control unruly patrons even with the police's ineffectiveness. She extended a job offer as head bouncer to Elwood, who initially declined but took her number in case he changed his mind. Later, Dalton attempted suicide by driving his car into a freight train but hesitated at the last moment. However, his car mysteriously stalled, resulting in its destruction without harm to him. Elwood reconsidered Frankie's offer and embarked on a coach bus journey to Glass Key, where her establishment was located. Upon arrival, he met Charlie, a teenage girl, and her father Stephen, who ran a bookstore. Elwood shared his newfound job prospect at Frankie's Roadhouse, prompting Stephen to provide directions to the establishment, simply named the Roadhouse. Dalton arrived at the Roadhouse and ordered coffee. One of the staff, Billy, recognized him, while Frankie watched from afar. Dalton remarked to the bartender that the place seemed quiet, making the staff smile knowingly. That evening, Dalton observed the rowdy customers getting into fights, but Billy managed them well. Suddenly, a motorcycle gang stormed into the Roadhouse. The ringleader, Dell, began causing chaos, destroying Roadhouse property. Dalton intervened, sending Billy away to get things in order. He tricked the gang into going outside, where they were followed by Frankie and curious Roadhouse staff and clientele. Dalton fought and subdued the gang members. After the altercation, Dalton borrowed Frankie's car to take the gang members to the hospital. There, he encountered Ellie, a disapproving doctor. She noticed Dalton's injuries and offered to tend to them, despite his initial hesitation. Eventually, he agreed. Ellie carefully peeled off the duct tape from Dalton's old injury, reassuring him that the wound wasn't infected. After covering it up and providing him with antibiotics, she left, and Dalton thanked her. As he left the hospital, he noticed some men watching him. Back at the Roadhouse, Frankie gave Dalton a week's wage and mentioned a hotel if he needed a place to stay. Dalton mentioned an abandoned floating boat he'd seen and wanted to buy. Frankie revealed that the boat belonged to her, coming with the Roadhouse from her uncle. She warned him about a crocodile that had killed the dock master's dog but welcomed him to stay. Dalton cleared out the boat to make it his home and had a dream about his past life as a UFC fighter. The next morning, Laura woke him with breakfast, expressing her hope that he'd stay unlike the previous bouncers. As Dalton headed to Charlie's bookstore to use her computer, he heard her yelling at gang members he'd fought the previous night, urging them to leave after they took something without paying. Using the computer, Dalton learned about Charlie's late mother owning the bookstore. When he asked about her dad, Charlie revealed her mother's passing the previous year and her dad's struggles to make ends meet. Afterward, Dalton returned to the Roadhouse. Dalton asked Frankie why everyone in town knew his name. She simply explained that it was just how things were. Meanwhile, Mo and Clyde, who Dalton had beaten, reported to their boss, Ben Brandt. They informed him that Dell was still in the hospital, which only angered Ben. Another of Ben's men, Vince, suggested scaring Dalton off by involving Ben's father. Dalton took on the role of mentoring Billy on handling unruly clients. Billy seemed to catch on quickly, but Dalton intervened when a client attempted to stab Billy, breaking the client's wrist. He also recruited Reef, who owned a surfing tools store, as a bouncer, mentoring him as well. After seeing off a drunk client, Dalton noticed Dell and other bikers outside, looking at him threateningly before riding off. At night, Dalton woke up from another dream about his time as a UFC fighter. While Dalton was having a meal at an open restaurant, he spotted Ellie, who joined him. He remarked on the aggressive behavior of the locals. Ellie explained that people there had their own way of doing things, even with the cops turning a blind eye. She warned Dalton that messing with the wrong people could lead to harm. As Ellie left, Dalton commented on her hair. Back at the Roadhouse, Frankie showed Dalton a picture of her uncle and shared stories about the work he put into the place. On his way home, Laura offered Dalton a ride, but he declined. Later, an attempt was made on Dalton's life as he was thrown off a high bridge by a truck. Surviving the ordeal, Dalton returned home to find Dell in his boathouse, pointing a gun at him. In a struggle, Dalton threw Dell overboard, and he was eaten by a crocodile despite efforts to save him. The next day, the sheriff searched for Dell's remains in the water, with Ben informing Dalton they wouldn't find anything. Dalton was then approached by one of Brandt's men, Jack, who insisted on taking him to see his boss. Dalton refused, prompting Dex to reach for his gun. In response, Dalton broke Dex's fingers and disabled the gun. Another man, Sam, emerged from the truck, but Dalton instructed him to tell his boss to come to the Roadhouse if he wanted to see him. He then advised Sam to take Dex to the hospital before departing. Frankie was startled to find Dalton in her office. She asked him how he was doing after the accident that killed Dell, to which he responded that he was fine. Frankie confessed that she was happy Dell was dead because he had been causing havoc at her Roadhouse for months. Dalton questioned if there might be a reason Dell was fixated on the Roadhouse, but Frankie didn't know, suggesting he might have been trying to be territorial. Meanwhile, Dex informed Brandt about Dalton breaking his fingers and refusing to come with him. This angered Brandt because Dalton was standing in his way of acquiring the Roadhouse. He received a call from his incarcerated father but angrily threw his phone into the ocean. Ellie took Dalton out on her ex-boyfriend's speedboat to the middle of the sea for a picnic. She asked him questions, and although he answered reluctantly, he eventually suggested they leave, unaware that she considered it a date. Dalton told Ellie she didn't want to know him, but she insisted she could make her own decisions, having researched his past online. Their conversation led to a passionate kiss. Brandt's incarcerated father tasked lunatic Knox, an enforcer, to take care of Dalton, who was proving difficult for Brandt. Knox showed up at Brandt's house, where he was challenged by Clyde and punched him. Later, Brandt arrived and found Knox, who explained he had been sent by his daughter to deal with Dalton. Brandt questioned how his father would have known, as he was in prison, and Knox revealed that Brandt's dad had spies everywhere. Brandt insisted that he didn't need Dalton's help and claimed he would handle things himself, but if he couldn't, then Knox could intervene. Ellie dropped Dalton back at his boathouse, then departed. 2 sheriff deputies approached Dalton, asking him to come with them for questioning about Dell's death. Dalton agreed, and Ellie witnessed the exchange as she rowed away on the boat. Dalton was taken to a port where Sheriff Black ordered him to leave town, but Dalton refused. In response, Black threatened to arrest him for anything, then ordered his men to remove Dalton from the vehicle and proceeded to beat him. However, Ellie arrived just in time, slapping Black and telling Dalton to go with her. She revealed to Dalton that Black was corrupt, and after her mother's death, she had moved away and changed her last name. She explained that her dad used to work for Brandt's father, Gerald, who dealt in drugs, but he was now in prison, so her dad was working for Brandt. Ellie urged Dalton to leave Glaskey. Meanwhile, Brandt's men burned down Charlie and Steven's store. Later, Brandt met Dalton at the Roadhouse, attempting to persuade him to leave town. When persuasion failed, Brandt taunted Dalton about his past, particularly an incident where Dalton killed his opponent in a UFC title fight, who happened to be a friend, when overcome with rage. After not getting a response from Dalton, Brandt left, and Frankie noticed him leaving. Outside, Brandt gave Knox and his men the order to deal with Dalton. Meanwhile, Frankie confronted Brandt about his visit to her establishment. Knox caused chaos, triggering a bar fight, and hitting Billy when he approached. He then called out Dalton, and they engaged in a vicious fight, both relentless. Knox repeatedly punched Dalton while he was held down. Eventually, the fight moved outside, and Dalton walked away. Ellie arrived at the Roadhouse to treat the wounded, including Billy, but Dalton ignored her when she called out to him. Frankie returned to find the Roadhouse empty. Meanwhile, at the boathouse, Dalton dressed his wounds and packed his bags to leave. Frankie arrived, admitting that Brandt had been trying to buy up her property to build an expensive resort, as she was the lone holdout. She revealed that Brandt was bankrupt and borrowing money from shady people, risking his life if he couldn't pay. Dalton assured her to keep holding out as he prepared to leave, admitting he was more afraid than she could imagine. Brandt was informed that Knox failed to kill Dalton as planned due to the wrong cops showing up, and Sheriff Black couldn't help them. On his way to the bus stop, which happened to be in front of Charlie's burnt-down bookstore, Dalton discovered the devastation. He sought out Charlie and Steven, only to learn they were at the hospital. Missing his bus, Dalton proceeded to Brandt's house, where he encountered Vince, one of the men responsible for burning down the bookstore. In a fit of rage, Dalton killed Vince and stashed his body in the trunk of a nearby truck. While doing so, he encountered Mo, who informed him about Brandt's impending windfall. Later, Dalton captured a sheriff's deputy making a large delivery of Brandt's illicit cash, framing the deputy for Vince's murder and seizing the money. Back at the boathouse, Dalton packed Vince's body in a cooler with ice. That night, he was roused from sleep by a haunting dream of the fatal punch he delivered in the past. The next morning, Dalton set out for the point where Brandt's cash would be delivered. He captured another deputy, using his gun to shoot Vince's body and framing him for the murder. Knocking out the deputy, Dalton took the money and anonymously reported the incident to the police. Back at the boathouse, Dalton assembled a bomb. Sheriff Black arrived, demanding Dalton return Brandt's money, though Dalton denied having it. Black revealed that Ellie had been taken by Brandt in exchange for the money and begged Dalton for help. Dalton agreed, asking Black where they should meet to hand over the money, as he had hidden it. Dalton stole Ellie's boyfriend Dex's motorboat, promising to return it intact. Meanwhile, Knox went to Brandt's house but found it empty. Dalton reached Brandt's yacht, informing Sam that the money wasn't in the motorboat he arrived with. Sam took Dalton to meet Brandt, who was accompanied by the sheriff. The sheriff revealed that the kidnapping was a ploy to lure Dalton aboard, but Brandt admitted he was indeed holding Ellie hostage, which angered the sheriff. Brandt ordered Sam to harm Dalton, but they spotted Knox approaching on a motorboat. Brandt instructed his men to prevent Knox from boarding. Dalton detonated the bomb he had left on Dex's motorboat and went in search of Ellie. He found her below deck, trapped as water flooded in. Knox attempted to ram them with his motorboat, prompting Dalton to advise Ellie to escape to another boat nearby. However, she found Brandt already aboard and was recaptured. Dalton climbed onto Knox's motorboat, tossing him overboard. Knox clung to a rope as Dalton tried to lose him while pursuing Brandt. In a dramatic confrontation, Dalton managed to board Brandt's boat just as Brandt tried to ram him. As Brandt attempted to strike Ellie, Dalton intervened, and they both leaped off the boat as Brandt crashed into the Roadhouse. Miraculously, Knox survived and made his way ashore, hijacking a pickup truck on the bridge. Dalton and Ellie swam ashore, with Dalton heading to the Roadhouse to find Brandt. He narrowly avoided being shot by a fishing spear, then engaged in a brutal fight with Brandt. However, Knox crashed into the Roadhouse, hitting Dalton and sending him flying. The two engaged in a vicious brawl, with Knox ultimately stabbing Dalton with a shard of wood. Brandt ordered Knox to kill Dalton, but Knox turned on Brandt instead, snapping his neck. He then attempted to finish off Dalton with another shard of wood, but Dalton managed to overpower him, using the wood to stab Knox multiple times. Ellie stumbled upon the scene, filled with hesitation as she looked at Dalton. He apologized to her. The sheriff arrived, instructing Dalton to leave town and promising to cover for him. Ellie agreed, urging Dalton to go. Reluctantly, Dalton walked away. Meanwhile, Frankie and her staff began cleaning up the Roadhouse, hoping to salvage what they could. Steven started rebuilding his store. As Dalton waited for his bus, Charlie approached him to bid farewell. Steven discovered that Dalton had left them the trunk of cash, but he was unable to thank him in time as the bus pulled away. As Dalton's bus passed in front of the Roadhouse, Billy glanced at it knowingly. In a mid-credits scene, Knox survived and assaulted the hospital staff, leaving wearing nothing but his hospital gown. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe. I would also appreciate a comment because it helps like you can't even imagine. It's a new channel and every bit of support counts.